on, honey?
The son and the girlfriend are beat up too.
The son and the girlfriend? Okay.
Oh my God, there's one in the living room too.
Memorial Day weekend is usually a time for celebration. Think barbecues, graduation parties, a break from routine to really be with people that we love and just enjoy the weather and enjoy being around people. But in 2005, for one small Ohio town, that weekend turned into a nightmare. Inside two homes just a quarter-mile apart, police would uncover a scene so horrific that it left even seasoned investigators shaken. Yet, within hours, they had already decided who was to blame. But what if the person they blamed was actually a victim in all of this? What if the only survivor, who nearly died herself, was telling the truth, and nobody believed her? And I'm sorry to darken your holiday weekend, guys, but today I am covering one of the most brutal and least known Memorial Day massacres. It's a case with small-town charm, farm life, and a graduation weekend that turned into a complete nightmare. And the deeper you go, the more you'll be asking, what really happened that morning? And why did the questions suddenly stop? I'm Annie Elise. Thank you guys for being here. Let's get into it. Bellefontaine is a small city in Ohio, about 45 miles north of Columbus. Now, by Midwest standards, it's actually considered a pretty decent-sized town with a population of around 13,000, but make no mistake, this is still in the middle of Ohio, so it is surrounded by like farmland everywhere. So in the grand scheme of things, it's a small city with a very small-town feel. And it's the kind of place where people grow up surrounded by cornfields, waking up early to feed the chickens, milk the cows, tend to the pigs, all the stuff I know nothing about. And when they get older, they don't move far away. They really inherit the family farm, and they keep that tradition going. It's kind of like a slice of the American dream, except here it's just real life. Now, in 2005, Bellefontaine was home to a family that really embodied that small-town farm life spirit, the Moody family. They were exactly the kind of family I just described too. I mean, generations of farmers, all raising cattle on the same land just outside of town. Their operation had grown into a very successful business too, spread across over 450 acres of farmland. Now at the time, just the land alone, not including the livestock or the equipment, it was valued at around $850,000. Today, that same property would be worth close to $1.4 million. So yeah, the Moody family was doing pretty well. The heads of the house were Gary and Cheryl Schaefer, and they got married pretty young. Gary was 22, Cheryl was only 21 years old. Yet at that age, their love was like, rock solid. Now, Gary had initially made a name for himself in horse racing and breeding circles. He traveled across the country showing off his horses, earning both respect and recognition in that world. But then, eventually, the couple expanded beyond just horses. They got into raising cattle, running a dairy business. And whenever they weren't working, they were also very heavily involved in their local church. Together, the two of them had a daughter named Sherry. Now, Sherry stayed in Bellefontaine after growing up, but unlike her parents, she didn't want to spend her whole life as a dairy farmer. That said, though, she never really left the farm completely. She still helped with the daily chores, but she held more of a traditional 9-to-5 job. She worked for the Ohio Department of Transportation. And somewhere along the way, Sherry married a man named Steve Moody. I don't know a ton about their relationship, but I do know that on August 12th, 1986, their first son was born, and they named him Scott. Then, 3 years later, they had a daughter named Stacy. At some point, Sherry and Steve split up, and I'm not sure whether it was an ugly divorce, maybe a quiet one, but both of them admitted that money was a big issue. They liked to spend more than they earned, and the financial tension with that eventually tore them apart. Steve moved on, remarried, and had 3 more children, and he went on to have a pretty big family. But Sherry never remarried. She stayed on the family farm, raising Scott and Stacy with the help of her parents. And Scott and Stacy grew up much like their mom had, feeding animals, milking cows, doing all the farm chores before and after school. Scott, in particular, was like your quiet, classic kind of farm kid, just quiet, polite, a little shy. He wasn't popular, he wasn't into drinking, he wasn't into parties, he mostly just kept to himself. And people liked him, but he just kind of had this quietness about him that made it a little difficult to get to know him. He didn't really open up much. However, there was one topic that could always bring him out of his shell, and that was farming. He loved it. He entered his livestock into state fairs, he did well in competitions, and he would talk about spending the rest of his life on that land, working on it long after graduation. As far as I can tell, Scott wasn't focused on college, which he didn't really need to be. I mean, let's be fair. His path was already clear. He was going to be taking over the family farm. He was even part of a school program that let him earn class credit for working on the farm. So Scott knew exactly what he wanted out of life, and he was already putting in the work to make that happen. So when graduation day rolled around on Sunday, May 29th, 2005, it wasn't just a big day for Scott. It was a proud moment for the entire Moody family. That year, graduation happened to fall on Memorial Day weekend, and Scott's family was so proud of him. They even bought him a personalized message in the graduation program. You know, when you get like the flyer and somebody rents out like a page or a half page and a photo and a tribute, something like that. And their note read, "Good luck and have fun, Scott Moody. Love, Stacy and Mom." Now, Sherry, Scott's mom, who was 37 years old at the time, wanted to make sure that her son felt celebrated. So the night before the ceremony, she threw him a huge party. Friends, food, fun. I mean, it was everything that you would hope for a milestone moment like that. Except it didn't stay that way for long. Because what no one knew at the time was that just a few hours later, that same farmhouse would become the site of one of the most horrific massacres the town of Bellefontaine had ever seen. It was Saturday, May 28th, the day before graduation, and Sherry had invited just about everyone to Scott's pre-graduation party. His friends from high school were there, a few family members, and two people in particular who would, unfortunately, become central to this story: his girlfriend, Paige Harshbarger, and a friend of his named Megan Karras. Now let's take a second to talk about Paige and Megan. Paige was just 14 years old, but she and Scott had a lot in common, especially their love for farm life. She too was a part of Future Farmers of America, a school club for students who are interested in agriculture. And they had actually only started dating about 10 days before this party, so it was an extremely new relationship. But still, she was there to support him and to celebrate his big night, his graduation. Megan, the other friend at the party, was 19 years old, and she was also set to graduate the very next day. So she wasn't just there for Scott, she was also celebrating her own milestone too. Now, I don't know the entire age difference in all this, because 19 does seem a little bit old for graduating high school, but it is said that they were graduating together. Now, Megan was well-rounded, an honor roll student, an athlete, a choir singer, and she was also a regular at their church. She had plans to study social work in college later that fall. And I know it's kind of a lot to keep all of these names and people straight, parents, siblings, friends, extended family, the works. It was a full house. But truthfully, that might have also been how Scott felt too. While everybody else was laughing and mingling, Scott kind of just slipped away from the crowd to watch TV, to just veg out and chill on his own. Not because anything was wrong, that was just him. Remember, he wasn't big on small talk or being the center of attention. He kind of kept to himself. And nobody thought twice about it. Scott keeping to himself wasn't unusual. But eventually, a few of his friends did end up managing to pull him back into the party and have some fun. They played a few games of pool, he started to relax, they all were joking around, and all in all, Scott ended up loosening up, being in a really good mood. Then, as the night went on, the party started getting a little more rowdy, and it actually got so loud that the police received 10 separate noise complaints. Now keep in mind, the Moodys lived all the way out in the country. Their nearest neighbors weren't even that close by. So for this party to be loud enough to trigger that many complaints, they were definitely going hard. They were raging. Eventually, an officer even showed up at the house, and I'm not sure if they spoke to Sherry, Scott, or somebody else, but either way, it was a routine call where they got a noise complaint, they arrived, they approached it. So the officer asked them to keep the volume down, and whoever it was that answered the door was cooperative. They apologized, they promised to be quiet, that they would calm things down, and that was it. No red flags, no drama, no warning signs that anything was about to go terribly wrong. Normal. But sadly, things were about to go terribly wrong. A little while later, things began winding down, and graduation was now only a couple hours away. People were tired, they were ready to call it a night, and most of the guests said their goodbyes and headed home. Scott's grandparents, Gary and Cheryl, lived on a separate house on the same property, just, a quarter mile down the road or so they headed home as well. And by the end of the night, only 6 people were still at the Moody house. Sherry, Scott, his younger sister Stacy, Paige, the girlfriend, Megan, the friend, and one more friend, Brett Davidson. Now, I didn't mention Brett earlier, but he was a longtime friend of Scott's, and like many others in their world, he lived on a farm too and had animals to care for in the morning. And while he could have driven home late that night, he figured that it would make more sense to just crash there and then head out early. So the plan was for Paige, Megan, and Brett to all spend the night, then attend graduation together as a group the next morning. Well, except for Brett. He had tickets to a baseball game. But either way, he had a full day ahead of him, so they all were going to just crash, get to bed, and then start the day fresh. And Sherry, his mom, was fine with everybody staying over. And presumably, so were all of their parents too. So the entire Moody family was accounted for. Scott's closest friends were also asleep under the same roof. And for a quiet moment, everything seemed peaceful. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Brett's alarm went off. Remember, he had animals he had to tend to at the farm too before going to the baseball game. So he got up, trying not to wake anybody else up, gathering his things very quietly, tiptoeing out to leave. And as he moved through the house, he ran into Sherry, already awake and making breakfast. She even offered to cook something for him, but he just politely declined. He had his chores to do at home and a busy day ahead. So he walked out the door and he headed home. Now, at the time when Brett left, everything seemed fine and normal. There were no signs he could see that anything was wrong at the Moody house or that anybody was in any kind of trouble. But within just moments of Brett leaving, all of that would change. From the time that he left until sometime before 10:30 a.m., no one heard anything from the Moody home. But then, shortly before 10:30 a.m., Scott's sister, 15-year-old Stacy, made a phone call to her stepsister, Nicole. And the moment that Nicole answered, she could tell that something was seriously wrong. Stacy sounded disoriented, confused. She said somebody had come into the house and attacked her and also had beaten up her mom, Sherry. She kept saying she was trying to wake her mom up, but that she couldn't. But then, as Stacy continued talking, her story it didn't make much sense. Nicole could tell that she was in trouble, but the details were murky. Who attacked them? Was that person still there? Was Sherry unconscious or worse, dead? So Nicole didn't waste any time trying to get answers over the phone. She just jumped in her car and she drove straight to the Moody house. And the second that she walked through the door, she realized Stacy hadn't been beaten, neither had Sherry, because the truth was so much worse. Bad enough that Nicole immediately picked up the phone and called 911.
Oh my God! God!
What's going on, honey?
The son and the girlfriend are beat up too.
The son and the girlfriend? Okay.
Oh my God, there's one in the living room too.
Right away, police rushed to the Moody house, and what they found inside was far worse than anything that they could have ever imagined. Meanwhile, at the exact same time, something else was starting just a few miles away. The graduation ceremony at Riverside High School. Students, teachers, and families, they were all filling the auditorium, ready to celebrate, take photos, watch their seniors walk across the stage. But there were two noticeable absences: Scott Moody and Megan Karras. Now, at first, no one really quite knew what to make of it. Scott and Megan had spent the last 13 years working toward this moment. This was the day, a milestone that they had talked about, planned for, and looked forward to. They definitely wouldn't just skip it without a reason. So when the ceremony began and their seats were still empty, teachers and administrators kind of huddled together, trying to decide whether to wait for them or just move forward with the ceremony. But then they got a phone call, and the staff made the decision to continue the ceremony, but they didn't say a word about why Scott and Megan were missing. So as diplomas were handed out and cameras were flashing, many people in the crowd were all whispering to each other, just confused. Where were they? Why aren't they here? What happened? And then, just as the ceremony was wrapping up, one of the school officials stepped up to the mic. And I'm guessing they had been waiting to share this news because they wanted everybody to enjoy their big moment of getting their diploma. They also probably felt, though, that they shouldn't keep this information to themselves any longer, so now would be the time to share it. So they shared with everybody on the mic that the reason that Scott and Megan were not there for graduation was because they were dead. Even worse, they had been murdered. They also said that right then, at that moment, as they were speaking, the police were actively investigating the scene. And they had already learned that Scott and Megan were not the only victims. Everyone in that house had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle. Even Stacy, the one who made the call to her stepsister Nicole that morning, which I'll get to that shortly here in a moment. And this mass murderer hadn't stopped at just the Moody's house. they also killed Gary and Cheryl, the grandparents, inside their home a quarter-mile away. So think about that. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. You don't kill every person in a house, then walk or drive all the way to a different house on the other side of the property and kill those people there too. I mean, not unless your goal is to slaughter everyone. Not unless this is targeted. Now, based on the crime scene, which I'm about to get into, the police thought that they had a pretty good sense of what had happened fairly quickly. Their theory was that Gary and Cheryl had died first, that their murders were probably sometime between 7 and 10 a.m., although the investigators never managed to pin down a smaller window than that. The two of them were shot in the kitchen of their home, all while they were cooking breakfast. There were no signs of a struggle, so it also seemed safe to assume that they never really even had a chance to realize that they were in danger, let alone fight back before the gun went off. Then, after that, they think that the killer went to, or back to, I should say, the Moody house, where the rest of the family lived and where that party had been that night before. They believe they walked through the place one by one, just gunning people down before they could even get up. Megan was asleep in the living room when the murderer went and shot her. Paige was in Scott's bedroom, and I'm not sure if the two of them literally slept in the same bed together or if maybe Scott's mom was okay with her teenage son sleeping with a 14-year-old that he had only dated for 2 weeks. I don't know. And maybe there was even a spare bed or somebody was on the floor. I don't really know. In any event, I do know that they were in the same room, and that is where Paige was shot. Sherry was in her bedroom, shot in bed, which I'll be honest, I don't really know how to make that fit with the fact that Sherry was awake and making breakfast at 6 a.m. Maybe she got started on cooking, realized nobody else was getting up, and then went back to sleep for like a nap and then was shot in bed. I don't know. That's just my guess because the police do say that she was shot in her sleep. So although there were a lot of questions, there weren't any questions about what had happened. Sherry, Megan, and Paige were all dead from their wounds by the time the police made it to them. And some of them had multiple bullet wounds, like the murderer had been very careful not just to shoot them and walk away, but to make sure that they were actually dead, like multiple shots. But when the attacker got to Stacy, they didn't quite manage to kill her. Now we know that she was shot in her bed because there was a lot of blood on her pillow and her blankets. The bullet hit her in the neck, which then left her injured and losing a lot of blood. That's probably why she sounded so confused on the phone call that she made to Nicole, because she was barely conscious at that time. Now, like I said before, the police never quite worked out the timeline of the murders, not with any real, specific details. I know they happened sometime between 7 a.m. and 10 a.m. and that Stacy called Nicole shortly after 10 a.m., but that's really all we know. It's possible that she was shot just a few seconds before she dialed Nicole's number and that she was making the call, right in the immediate aftermath of the attack, and that's why she couldn't quite gather what was going on. But it's also possible that she got hit much earlier than that, and maybe she spent some time unconscious or even hiding before she was able to get to the phone and make that call. The point is, nobody knows for sure. By the time that the police made it to the scene, Stacy was still alive, but she was unconscious from blood loss. She was just lying on the floor of the kitchen right next to the phone that she had used. And it looked like maybe she had used her absolute last ounce of strength to call Nicole, and then just finally passed out from her injuries. The first responders rushed her to the hospital, but they weren't able to question her at that time, for obvious reasons. She was recovering, she was unconscious, there wasn't the time for questions. But as a quick side note, I do have to say, Scott's friend Brett was incredibly lucky. If he had decided to sleep in for even another hour or another couple of hours, he might have been at the house at the time of the murders, and he could have been killed alongside everybody else. So anyway, the police said that they knew that the killer had murdered Gary and Cheryl first, and then that they had killed Sherry and Megan and shot Stacy. Although with Sherry, Megan, and Stacy, they weren't 100% sure what order that was in. What they were sure about, though, was that Scott was shot to death last. And get this, according to a journalist who covered the case, Scott was found in his bed, but he wasn't lying in it like he had been asleep at the time of the murder. No. He was apparently sitting at the bottom of it with his feet still on the ground when he was found. There were also 2 gunshot wounds in his head, including one that definitely looked self-inflicted, which I'm going to put a pin in that and I'm going to come back later because I do want to talk more in depth about his injuries in a bit. But I will say that the gun that was lying next to his body was the exact same kind of gun that killed all of the other members of his family and injured Stacy. and the way that it was laying was exactly how it would have landed if he had been holding it, then shot himself, and then died and dropped it. So the position of Scott's body, all on its own, told a very clear story here. He had taken his own life after killing a bunch of people in his house that night. And if you've been following my channel or follow true crime in general, you probably know about this pattern that does happen sometimes. Sometimes people will kill their entire families and then take their own lives at the end of it. And there's a word for it, family annihilators. I've actually covered quite a few cases of family annihilators here in the past on my channel, some even recently in the past few weeks and months. Anyways, that's what the police figured had happened here. Given that there were no signs of forced entry or struggle, it made sense that the murderer was somebody with access to both the Moody house and Gary and Cheryl's house, which was the case for Scott. It seemed clear that he had wiped out his entire family and then killed himself. The thing that was less clear in all of this was why. I mean, everyone who knew Scott saw him as this sweet and kind kid and not violent. He certainly seemed to love his family and get along with them. So nobody could think of any reason of why he would want to hurt them, let alone kill them all. A bunch of Scott's friends said he didn't even like guns. He never used them. It just wasn't him. Which, if you know anything about country living and farm life, you know that guns and hunting and shooting are a big part of the culture there, right? But Scott wasn't like a lot of the other country guys. He didn't go to shooting ranges or hunt, so it felt pretty uncharacteristic for him to just snap and kill his whole family using a rifle. Plus, one of his friends even came forward early in the investigation and shared a story about Scott. The story goes that one day he was driving down a back road in his truck when a rabbit ran out right in front of him. Some other guys might have just kept going and, ran right over the rabbit, but not Scott. He slammed on the brakes and the whole truck screeched to a stop, all because he didn't want to kill a little wild animal. Which you've got to wonder, if someone is so careful not to kill a rabbit as roadkill, are they really going to slaughter their own entire family, their whole family? A ton of people who knew Scott, including his classmates and his teachers and his neighbors, and basically everybody else, said, absolutely not. He's not a killer. He didn't have a violent bone in his body. The superintendent of the school also gave a statement to the press where she said, it couldn't possibly be Scott. He was a farmer at heart. He worked the land. And Brett, that friend who spent the night and left just an hour or so before the shooting began, he said he didn't believe that Scott was the killer either. He knew his friend very well, and he said Scott just wasn't capable of doing something like this. Which at this point, I'm sure you're probably wondering, okay, well, what about his sister Stacy? If she was shot and survived, wouldn't she be able to confirm if it was him or not? And I'll be getting to that shortly. Don't worry. But anyway, even while everyone in Bellefontaine was basically arguing with the police, insisting that they were investigating the wrong person and that Scott definitely didn't do this, the investigators tried to see if Scott had any motive to kill everybody that he knew and then kill himself. And as it turned out, there were some rumors going around that Scott had some serious disagreements with his mother and his grandparents. The gossip was vague and nobody was able to share any specifics, but the gist was that Scott wanted to change the way the family ran their farm, and Sherry, Gary, and Cheryl were not thrilled about any of his ideas. Apparently, Gary and Cheryl had done a bad job of filing their taxes one year. They hadn't paid enough. And by the time they found out the mistake and realized that they owed much more, there were a bunch of fines, a bunch of interest that had been added on top of the original amount, and they were drowning in this debt. So now they had to write a check to the IRS for $56,000, which in today's money, that's a little over $91,000. It's a ton of money. And Gary and Cheryl didn't have tens of thousands of dollars just sitting around in an account ready to be spent. They couldn't pay the bill without selling off some of the property, specifically the property that was supposed to be Scott's inheritance. So the rumor was that Scott was upset about this arrangement. He thought that it was unfair. He wanted his grandparents to figure out some other way of paying that bill, a way that didn't involve him losing out on some of his land that was going to be his whole future. There are also some rumors that Scott didn't really approve of his mom's farming methods, or, to be more accurate, lack thereof farming methods. Apparently, his dad Steve was the real farmer in the family, and when Steve and Sherry had been married, Steve had handled most of the work and managed everything, which makes sense because, like I said before, Sherry had an office job with the government. She didn't have a whole lot of time to manage an entire farm on top of that, nor did she really have the desire. But after the divorce, and after Steve was basically out of the picture, Sherry had started neglecting the farm. I guess she didn't really take care of the cows, so because of that, since they were neglected, they didn't make very much milk. I guess that's how it goes. She also never mowed the lawn or pulled weeds out of the garden, and apparently the whole place was just falling apart. And apparently Scott had a problem with that because he wanted the farm to be successful. So now the question was becoming, did Scott really kill everyone he loved and himself because they didn't do a good job of taking care of some cows or mowing the lawn? Well, that's the only motive that anyone on the police force could come up with. That was it. And again, the people who actually knew Scott said that he would never kill anyone over something like this. Plus, the fighting in the family certainly never got heated enough for anyone to feel like their lives were in danger. In fact, a bunch of Scott's friends had never even heard anything about that tax bill or about the land being sold or any of it. And certainly if Scott was mad, he would have been venting to his friends. Plus, apparently before the murders, Scott had been helping his mom apply for grants and also help find other ways to get money to keep the farm going, to keep it running and under their control. Meaning, okay, yeah, sure, he was concerned about the financial situation, but he was taking steps to fix it in a non-violent way. All to say, the police's conclusion to this whole case just made no sense whatsoever. But now I want to talk a little bit about his sister Stacy, because the good news is that while Stacy was, yes, badly injured, she did end up recovering. It took some time, but eventually she woke up in the hospital and she was coherent. Now the bad news is, the case against Scott had already officially been closed by the time the investigators got Stacy's statement. And I don't mean that the investigation was just slowing down, I mean, it was officially closed. No follow-up, no alternative suspects, no second guesses. The conclusion for them was simple. Scott did it. End of story, case closed, which to me is so unbelievable. Which, to be fair, we don't have a clear timeline of exactly when Stacy gave her statement. Maybe it was a few hours later, maybe it was a few days later. I mean, yes, she was injured severely, so the delay makes sense on a medical level. But still, they closed the case within hours or days of discovering a crime scene. That fast. So then, when they finally sat down to hear from the only surviving witness, they weren't even looking for answers at that point. They were just looking for confirmation. They weren't even asking what had happened. They were asking why Scott did it. And what they got was something that they did not expect. Or, I don't know, maybe they did. Because when Stacy finally told them what happened that morning, she flat out said, Scott didn't do this. According to Stacy, on the morning of the murders, she woke up and she saw someone inside her bedroom pointing a gun at her. But this person was not Scott. It was a man that she had never seen before, a complete stranger. Stacy said that this guy wasn't a teenage kid. He was grown. He had gray hair. He had a stockier build. Definitely could not have been mistaken for Scott, and was definitely bigger than Scott. And before Stacy could say anything to this guy, he just shot her twice in the neck. Then, just like what the police had suspected during their investigation, she laid in bed, bleeding out for a while. She was hurt. She also could hear gunshots in other parts of the house as she was lying there, so she knew that this man was now going after other members of her family. Then, after hearing all of this and lying there, she eventually mustered up enough energy to make the call to Nicole. Now, the point, according to Stacy in this, was that Scott was not the killer. He hadn't slaughtered his own family. He was as much a victim as everybody else in this. But unfortunately, the officers didn't believe Stacy's story about this gray-haired older man. They didn't even believe her for a second. It just did not add up for them. Which it's hard to say why Stacy would lie, and the police have never come out and given a good explanation for what her motive would have been in giving a false statement. It doesn't really track. I mean, if I had to guess, I would say it seems pretty likely that they thought that maybe she was trying to protect her brother, maybe try to make it look like it was a random stranger who was responsible instead of him, as to not tarnish his legacy. Or maybe they just figured that she was confused or misremembering. I mean, after all, Stacy had been through something very traumatic and something that had almost killed her. So maybe she was mixed up, or maybe even was having hallucinations from the blood loss. Who really knows? But they were sure this was Scott. But still, Stacy was consistent and very firm. She said Scott didn't do it. She even insisted on letting him have his memorial service and funeral at the same time as her mom and her grandparents, because she didn't want him to be treated any differently or honored any less than her other family members. And the interesting thing is that the people of Bellefontaine apparently felt the same as her. There were more than 130 people at this funeral, and once it was done, a bunch of the attendees all piled flowers on top of all of the graves. Gary, Cheryl, Sherry's, and Scott's, not treating Scott any differently. Certainly not treating him like a cold-blooded mass family murderer. So everyone already believed Scott was innocent. And then here Stacy was, the one eyewitness, also saying he didn't do it. Everybody saying this doesn't track with his behavior, this isn't like him, he hated guns, he wouldn't have done this. And Stacy being like, I saw who did this, it wasn't Scott. And again, it's hard to say why Stacy would lie, if she was lying, that is. But there was also one officer who made it his mission to find out the truth. Or at least, that's what he claimed. This man's name was John Stout. And while he said he was trying to help, you'll see soon enough that he had his own reasons for getting close to Stacy. Reasons that had nothing to do with justice. According to John, it was clear that Stacy knew more than what she was saying, and he thought that he could get her to admit the truth if he got to know her better, almost like going undercover in a way. So from that day onward, he tried to be a sort of friend and father figure towards Stacy. He spent a lot of time with her too, talking about life, his hobbies, what he liked to do for fun. And John was 36 years old. But if anybody would ask him why he was spending so much time with a 15-year-old girl, kind of getting close to her, gaining her trust, he said he was just trying to be a good detective. He wanted to solve the case, and he also wanted to be emotionally supportive for a very young victim of a very terrible crime. Well, it didn't take long for John's true intentions to reveal themselves, because only about 3 months later, on September 30th, 2005, he made a move on Stacy. 36 and 15. Disgusting. He had picked her up from school, high school that is, and then John asked her if she wanted to hook up before he took her home. Literally, a grown adult man in his late 30s told this 15-year-old girl he wanted to have sex with her. And she said yes, which I have to just say, Stacy was young, impressionable, and she had been groomed by him for 3 months at this point, thinking he was a trusted adult, somebody who loved her, who was looking after her. She was still grieving her family. She trusted this police officer who was supposed to keep her safe. She probably thought that John really loved her and was going to take care of her, and that she had landed this amazing, caring, grown, mature boyfriend who could keep her safe. So she said yes, and this is going to get a bit graphic for a moment, but she told him that he could finger her and also perform oral sex on her, which he did. Now, this was obviously disgusting and wrong on so many levels, not only because Stacy was underage, although that on its own would have made John's actions totally vile and atrocious, but also because she was very vulnerable. She was grieving. She literally didn't have her mother, her brother, her grandparents, and she also wanted to clear her brother's name because she was still insisting that Scott was innocent. Which, imagine how alone and scared you would feel after something like this. Then, this person who is supposed to help you fight for justice, a literal police officer, preys on you, violates you in a sexual way instead. It's sickening. Now, in no time at all, she came around and she was able to recognize just how messed up this entire situation was. So in October, she told her dad and her stepmom what was going on, and they escalated it by reporting John to the police. By early January, John had been put on suspension and was charged with public indecency, with the endangerment of children, with interference with custody, with contributing to the unruliness or delinquency of a child, and with 2 counts of sexual battery. Good on her for speaking up. His case ended up hitting a lot of delays, and in the meantime, he ended up getting fired from the force. But in the end, John ended up accepting a plea deal. He pled guilty to endangerment, and in exchange, all of the other charges were dropped. All of them, which is pretty infuriating, but it gets worse. Because while, yes, John admitted that he had put Stacy in danger, he didn't say how exactly. He didn't confess that it was wrong for him to groom her or abuse her or acknowledge that he was inappropriate with her and that is what was putting her in danger. None of that. Instead, he said that one time while he was driving around with Stacy in the car, he was tempted to speed. And that is what put her in danger. That was the child endangerment that he was admitting to. Now, of course, when Stacy spoke at the trial, she was very clear that what he had done was much worse than that. She even gave a statement where she said, "He knew just what to say to me. He said he understood how I felt. John S. took advantage of me at a time in my life when I didn't know what would happen next. My family was dead, gone forever, and John made me believe that he cared." Now his sentence, get this, his sentence was 90 days in jail and 1 year of probation. He also had to pay a $250 fine. That was it. That was it, which that plea deal does not sound fair to me, but it certainly does align with law enforcement protecting their own in certain situations. I will say that. And unfortunately, this wasn't going to be the end of Stacy's problems, because now she also had to go to court to work out the terms of her inheritance. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this part because I really want to get into why so many people believe that Scott was not the killer and what they say is proof behind that and who may have been. But I do think it's important to understand just a little bit of what Stacy was up against. Basically, she was the only surviving member of the Moody Schaefer family, and according to most of the wills, everything, the land, the assets, all of that was supposed to go to the closest living relative, which meant Stacy. But even so, the whole situation turned into a legal disaster. Some of the confusion had started long before the murders, after the death of Stacy's great-grandmother. Her will had been written in a way that left room for interpretation, and the family had already been trying to sort all of that out with lawyers for years. Then, after the murders, things got even more complicated, especially with the deaths of Megan and Paige, because their families could potentially pursue wrongful death lawsuits. But since Scott was no longer alive, any legal action would have to go through his estate, which meant that Scott had to legally inherit something so that there would be assets to sue. It was a very strange setup and one that Stacy didn't agree with because, remember, she believed Scott was innocent and she didn't want to see him treated like a criminal just because he wasn't there to defend himself. So she wasn't trying to deny Megan or Paige's family's justice. She just didn't think that that should come at the cost of her entire inheritance or at her brother's name. And when you step back and look at the full picture, it is pretty wild, right? I mean, this case had something incredibly rare, a surviving eyewitness. But instead of being believed, supported, or even taken seriously, Stacy was pushed aside. She was called a liar. And it made a lot of people wonder, was there more to this story than anybody was willing to admit? Well, a lot of people, including reporters who were completely impartial, thought the idea that Scott had committed a murder-suicide made absolutely no sense. I mentioned before that he had 2 head wounds, only one of which was obviously self-inflicted. The other one was behind his ear. So the only way for him to get hit at that angle was if he was holding this very long rifle behind himself, or reaching backward in a way and then pulling the trigger. Which technically, I guess it is possible, but it's awkward and unnatural and very hard to do. It's hard to imagine somebody killing themselves that way when there are much easier, simpler angles to fire from. Now, that gunshot from behind was the first one that hit Scott, but it didn't kill him. The second shot is what killed him, and that one went through his mouth. So that is the reason that police thought that it was self-inflicted, that he swallowed the gun. But get this, when the investigators found Scott's body, they also saw drag marks on his bed, like his bleeding body had been tugged from one area to another between the first and the second shot. Maybe somebody staging a scene? I mean, basically the only way for this to be possible and self-inflicted was if when he fired that first shot, Scott had been laying in the bed normally with his head close to the pillow and the headboard. Then, while he was bleeding, he supposedly dragged himself to the foot of the bed, and then that's when he gave himself the final wound. I mean, clearly a lot of people didn't buy that story. They didn't think that it was remotely believable. Instead, they thought it was one big rumor that had been going around Bellefontaine since the murders. It just didn't seem likely. It didn't track with everything that they knew about Scott, the evidence, the eyewitness account. None of it made sense. Instead, one big rumor that's been going around Bellefontaine since the murders was that the real killer broke in, shot Scott in the back of the head while he was asleep in bed, and then when that didn't kill him, they dragged him further down the bed and shot him in the mouth. Then left the gun there to frame him for a murder-suicide so that they would get away unscathed. And to be fair, that story also doesn't make a whole lot of sense either because Paige was sleeping in the same room, and in order for Scott to be asleep when he got shot, he would have had to have slept through her murder as well. So, I don't know, a lot of it is very confusing. But still, if this was a frame-up situation, it was a sloppy one because the crime scene just didn't make sense. Except then you've got to wonder, if it's true that Scott was murdered, and if it was so obvious that he didn't take his own life, wouldn't you expect the police to figure that out right away? Well, another popular theory is that the police did know who the real murderer was, and that it wasn't Scott. And instead, the investigators might have framed him to help the real killer get away. Now, one of those rumors has to do with a man named Joe Rosebrook, and if that name sounds familiar, it's probably because I did an entire episode about him on my podcast, Serialously. Now, if you haven't checked that one out yet, I highly recommend that you go listen to it after this. I will link it in the show notes. You need to hear it, and it'll all tie together for you. Here's a brief recap. But Joe was a very bad guy. He was a part of an organized crime operation. He murdered people. He was definitely not the sort of person that you wanted to be around. Unless, of course, you were also sketchy, and he could, throw you under the bus. And Joe was very good friends with John Stout. John Stout being that same police officer who preyed on Stacy. Joe has said on the record to anyone who would listen that John was dirty, not just because he was inappropriate to underage girls, but also that he was corrupt. He allegedly used his position as a police officer to help other criminals and other people involved with organized crime so they could cover up what they had done and get away with it. So one theory is that the Moody family was killed by someone, which I haven't heard any specific names get named, but there were a lot of unverified rumors going around that maybe Sherry or another member of the Moody family was a survivor of a sexual attack, and that the person who assaulted her might have been part of a powerful criminal organization. And as the gossip goes, and again, I don't have proof, this is just a rumor, but the gossip says that Sherry and her dad Gary wanted to fight back, that they went to the police wanting the attacker to be arrested and brought to justice. And allegedly John and some other like-minded officers were not willing to make enemies with the local mobsters over a single assault. So they say the police or somebody with the organized crime operation went to the Moody household and shot up everybody to stop them from pressing charges. Then the detectives purposefully botched the investigation and framed Scott so that nobody would ever identify the real killer or killers. Which, I'll be honest, I've heard a lot of outlandish things in my time. That one feels pretty far-fetched. Could it be possible? Maybe. Or could John Stout have been more involved in this? Rather than covering up for other people, could he have been involved in the shooting? Was there a motive or reason that he wanted to get close to Stacy besides just sexually grooming her? Was it to see what information she knew, see what she remembered, see what she said? There's some sort of link here, and I can't quite place it, and that's why I think you should go listen to the Joe Rosebrook episode that I put out, because there's something that's not clicking here. And I think after covering all of this information, you might understand why this case is so controversial too, why there's so much disagreement about what the truth is and who the real killer was. Now, the good news is that after the murders, the community of Bellefontaine came together to support Stacy. Brett came out, he would milk the cows every morning at their property, all on top of handling his own chores at his own farm, just trying to help her. Her neighbors and friends also handled some of the financial issues. They made sure that the milk from the cows eventually got sold at a good price. They tried to do everything they could to lift her up. But I don't know a whole lot about what Stacy's life is like today. I did see online that as of 2019, she was married to a man named Rick. I don't know his last name, and I've got to assume that that was intentional, that she wanted her privacy to be respected. But she did share this picture with the public through a journalist. So hopefully that's a sign that her life is on track and going well. But what happened? Why wasn't she believed? And who did kill this whole family and friends if it wasn't Scott? What really happened over Memorial Day weekend in 2005? I mean, we know it wasn't just a tragedy. It was the unraveling of an entire family. And nearly 20 years later, it's still a case that is wrapped in mystery, pain, and unanswered questions. Whether you believe Scott was guilty or not, one thing is undeniable. The people in charge definitely did not ask enough questions. They didn't follow the facts where they led. They didn't protect Stacy, the one person in all of this who needed it most and should have been believed most. So what do you think? Let me know what you guys think about this case, who you think the real killer was, and if it was Scott, what do you think the motive was? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching another episode with me. I know this case was a lot. It was wild. It was heavy to hear, but I want to know your thoughts. Do you think that Scott Moody is guilty? Was he the shooter? Was he the mass murderer? Or was he framed? Let me know below, and if you haven't already, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so that you never miss an episode of 10 to Life. All right, guys, until the next one, stay safe.